When the United States entered World War I, it didn't have enough guns for its troops and relied on weapons shared by its allies, particularly France. But the needs of the war led the nation to turn its industrial might toward the manufacture of rifles, pistols, shotguns, and machine guns. And throughout the war, developments in firearms continued to be made as gunsmiths and soldiers learned valuable and costly lessons about the kinds of guns needed in this modern age. And when the war in Europe ended, another kind of conflict broke out within the U.S. as gangsters, bank robbers, and bootleggers confronted police forces armed with newer, more powerful guns, with the evolution of the firearm. American General John T. Thompson saw the need for a new type of gun to use in the trench fighting of World War I. The bolt-action rifles carried by servicemen were excellent for ranged fire, but were too long and slow to reload for fighting inside the trenches. Thompson wanted a small, light machine gun that a soldier could use to sweep across the trench. Something small, light, and requiring minimal training. The result was the Thompson submachine gun, more commonly known as the Tommy gun. The Tommy gun could have been used to deadly effect in the trenches of World War I, except for the simple problem that it arrived too late. By the time the gun was fully developed, the war was over. The gun was used by U.S. Marines during conflicts in Nicaragua and Honduras, but this was never going to produce the sales needed by a gun manufacturer. Instead, the Tommy gun found its way into the hands of policemen in America, and also into the hands of the men they pursued. The Tommy gun, with its distinctive drum magazine, became as iconic a symbol of the Prohibition-era gangsters and Depression-era bank robbers as the six-shooter did of the American West. Infamous incidents, such as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, gave the Tommy gun its reputation as the gangster's weapon of choice. But in truth, the gun was used as much or more by police as by outlaws. Another military gun that saw use by some gangsters was the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, firing the .30-06 Springfield cartridge. Clyde Barrow and his girlfriend Bonnie Parker stole BAR rifles from National Guard armories and modified them to suit their own needs. Barrow shortened his BAR by sawing the barrel down to the same length as the gas cylinder tube, making it easier to fire from a moving car. The BAR had been developed by legendary gunsmith John Moseph Browning for use during World War I. It was ready a bit earlier than the Thompson, but it still didn't arrive until late in the war, with only a few units receiving the BAR before the armistice was signed. As World War II loomed on the horizon, the military needed a portable light machine gun and modified the BAR rifle. The new model 1918A2 no longer featured a semi-automatic firing option. It fired only in full automatic. The M1918A2 also had a skid-style bipod mounted at the muzzle end of the barrel to improve stability. U.S. Marine Private Wilson Douglas Watson used the BAR with distinction during combat at Iwo Jima. One of the most iconic images of World War II is the photograph by Joe Rosenthal of the U.S. Marines raising the American flag at the island of Iwo Jima. That photograph was taken just days into a 5-week battle that resulted in the American capture of the island. Private Watson was with the 2nd Battalion, 9th Marines, 3rd Marine Division at Iwo Jima. He was designated as an automatic rifleman, giving him the responsibility for the Browning automatic rifle. During actions on February 26th through 27th, 1945, Watson's squad was pinned down by intense fire from enemy fortifications in the high rocky ridges and crags commanding the line of advance. On his own, Private Watson rushed one pillbox, firing his rifle to keep the enemy pinned down. When he was in position, he hurled a grenade inside. He then rushed to the rear of the fortification in order to kill the enemy soldiers as they retreated. Watson's squad was now able to continue its advance. But they were pinned down once again at the foot of a small hill. Watson and his ammo bearer scaled the jagged incline under fierce mortar and machine gun barrages, firing from the hip as he climbed. From the reverse side of the hill, the Japanese soldiers attacked him with grenades and knee mortars. He stood fearlessly erect in his exposed position at the crest of the hill so that he could fire upon the enemy positions. For a harrowing 15 minutes, Private Watson held the hill under withering fire, killing 60 enemy soldiers before his ammunition was exhausted and the rest of his platoon could join him. Following that, he took out 2 more enemy positions, rescuing 4 Marines who had been pinned down by their fire. Over the 2-day period, Private Watson single-handedly eliminated 90 enemy soldiers, becoming known as the One-Man Regiment. On October 5th, 1945, President Truman presented him with the Medal of Honor. John Browning's Model 1918A2 BAR served as the military's light machine gun, while 2 other Browning guns served as the medium and heavy machine guns of World War II. The .30 caliber M1919 Browning developed out of the M1917 heavy machine gun used in World War I. That model was a workhorse that continued to serve during the Second World War. But Browning improved upon it in later designs, resulting in the M1919 being air-cooled with a perforated barrel shroud rather than a water jacket. There were multiple variations on the M1919, but the most common was the A4. It had both fixed and flexible mounts for use on vehicles or by infantry. The fixed mount made the M1919A4 a formidable defensive weapon on board bomber aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress. The flexible mount could attach to a tripod and be operated by just 2 infantrymen, the gunner and the loader. But though the Model 1917 had been a heavy machine gun in World War I, the M1919 was now a medium machine gun. The heavy gun was also Browning's. With the .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun, John Browning completed the trifecta of America's light, medium, and heavy machine guns of World War II. The M2 was similar in design to the M1919, but used a much larger .50 caliber cartridge developed at the same time as the gun. The M2 was created to address a need identified by commanders during World War I. The military needed a gun that could punch through the enemy's heavily armored vehicles and aircraft. The M2, also called the Ma-Deuce, served that need in various roles. In addition to being an infantry support weapon, it was an anti-aircraft gun on some ships, as well as on the ground. It also served as the primary or secondary weapon on many armored ground vehicles, and a light barrel version was used on aircraft. The Ma-Deuce can also serve as a sniper rifle. During the Vietnam War, U.S. Marine Gunnery Sergeant Carlos Hathcock II would use a scope-mounted M2 to kill the Viet Cong from 2,500 yards away, almost 1.5 miles. But most infantrymen were not carrying machine guns. During World War II, they were carrying the weapon that General George S. Patton, Jr. called the greatest battle implement ever devised, the M1 Garand. Often called simply the Garand or the M1, the rifle was designed by John Garand at the Springfield Armory. The M1 Garand was the first semi-automatic weapon to serve as the standard issue infantry arm in any country in the world. U.S. soldiers and Marines carrying it had a distinct advantage over their enemies, firing .30-06 cartridges out of an 8-round clip at a much faster rate than the standard bolt-action rifles. The M1 Garand usually had a 10 or 16-inch bayonet attached, making it an even more formidable weapon. One soldier who quickly qualified as an expert with the M1 and demonstrated its capabilities in combat was Private John R. McKinney. J.R. McKinney's 123rd Regiment landed in Luzon, the largest island in the Philippines, in February 1945. Over the next several months, they and other American units, combined with Filipino troops, succeeded in recapturing the island. Late in the campaign, the 123rd was tasked with security operations at the installations at Dingalan Bay on the eastern side of Luzon. While in Dingalan Bay, Private McKinney was one of several men who manned a machine gun emplacement protecting the defensive perimeter. At 5:30 a.m. on May 11th, 1945, McKinney had just been relieved from his night-long duty on the gun. He'd settled into the tent that he shared with 2 Filipino guerrillas and was just drifting off to sleep, his M1 Garand rifle cradled in his arms. He was awakened by the ruffling sound of his tent flap being opened. Thinking some of his buddies were playing a prank, he was surprised when the flaps flew open to reveal a Japanese Imperial Army soldier, sword in hand. The soldier swung the sword at McKinney's head, but only managed to slice through a bit of scalp and part of McKinney's ear. McKinney was stunned, but his training kicked in immediately. He rammed the butt of his rifle straight up into his attacker's chin. When the soldier fell, McKinney followed up with another strike, crushing the enemy's skull. Another Japanese soldier rushed in, bayonet first. McKinney shot him in the chest. As he struggled to make sense of what had just happened, gunshots outside his tent made it clear. The camp was under attack. McKinney rushed out of his tent. He could hear fighting to the north, but his responsibility was the southern perimeter, and the machine gun there wasn't firing. In the dim light, he looked over at the machine gun pit. He could see men ripping away the camouflage, struggling to maneuver the machine gun. Japanese soldiers trying to turn the gun to fire into the camp. McKinney fired his rifle, killing the 2 men. He then spotted 2 more Japanese nearby, moving towards the command tent. They spotted him in the same moment, but McKinney fired first. 2 headshots, and the enemy's soldiers were down. He looked again at the machine gun, still unmanned. He couldn't let the enemy seize it and turn it against the American and Filipino forces. McKinney rushed to the machine gun as the sounds of battle to the north grew louder. 2 American soldiers were down near the machine gun pit. One was seriously wounded, and the other, Private First Class Morris Roberts, was trying to move the wounded man to safety. The Filipino guerrillas who had been with them had vanished, perhaps to join the explosive battle on the northern perimeter. McKinney was still on his own. Private First Class Adolph Barrett was a rifleman assigned to help protect mortars located at the rear of the machine gun emplacement. He reported what he saw.
McKinney started dragging the gun to the rear so the attackers couldn't turn it on us. One of the gunners had been shot and the other was trying to evacuate him. I saw about 10 Japs armed with rifles, bayonets, and long pointed poles rush to position, but I was afraid to shoot into the group for fear of hitting one of my buddies. Then I was confronted by the infiltrating Japs trying to get at our mortars. Soon, I heard shrieks and screams and moans of the enemy coming from McKinney's direction.
10 Imperial Japanese soldiers swarmed toward, then into the machine gun pit. Private Roberts later described what he saw while he tried to aid his wounded comrade.
McKinney fired a short burst, killing the first 2 attackers. Then the place seemed to swarm with Japs, shooting one, bashing another with his rifle butt, kicking another, then dragging at the machine gun. He attracted enough attention to enable me to get the wounded man back to a covered position for first aid.
In the fight, the machine gun itself was jammed. McKinney now had only his rifle to fight off the enemy coming at him in waves. As the Japanese hurled grenades and directed knee mortar shells into the perimeter he defended, McKinney responded with accurate rifle fire, taking them down one by one. He kept moving, changing position and collecting more ammunition. Whenever his weapon ran out of ammo, he reversed it and clubbed the attackers to death with the rifle butt. At one point, he witnessed 4 Japanese soldiers moving near the position where he knew Private Roberts was caring for the wounded soldier. McKinney leapt from hiding, putting himself between the enemy and his friends. He shot 3 of the soldiers, reloaded, and shot the 4th before they were able to respond. For more than 30 minutes, Private J.R. McKinney waged a private war against overwhelming odds. He is officially credited with the deaths of 40 enemy soldiers, but some reports suggest the number was much higher. Finally, the attack on the northern perimeter was broken, and American soldiers there rushed to the southern perimeter to aid in its defense. When they arrived, they found a beach covered with the bodies of the enemy. Technical Sergeant Alfred Johnson described the scene.
We found McKinney in a firing position at his machine gun, bleeding from his left ear and breathing hard. He assured us he was all right. There were 38 freshly killed Japs piled 2 and 3 deep on their approach to the emplacement and around the gun, and 2 more lay near the knee mortar. Searching the bodies for documents, we found many cracked skulls and body contusions where McKinney's rifle butt and kicking feet had done their work.
For his actions that day, J.R. McKinney was promoted to sergeant, and on January 23, 1946, he was presented the Medal of Honor in a White House ceremony. As he placed the medal around Sergeant McKinney's neck, President Truman remarked, "There is no greater honor in the world To tell you the truth, I'd rather have earned one of these than be president. Making the rifle even more versatile, the M7 rifle grenade launcher could attach to the Garand to fire grenades. Tube-shaped, the M7 fit over the barrel of the Garand. A blank cartridge was loaded into the rifle. When fired, the rapidly expanding gas from the blank cartridge would launch the grenade hundreds of yards. The M1 Garand was the standard service rifle in World War II, but was not the appropriate arm for soldiers with specialized duties. A machine gun or mortar team, for example, was already heavily burdened. A lighter gun would be less cumbersome and better allow them to perform their duties, but handguns lacked the firepower needed when they were attacked. During World War II, German blitzkrieg attacks against strategic targets could also put headquarters staff and officers, as well as support units, into sudden combat. The solution needed was a lightweight automatic rifle. The U.S. Army looked at a dozen submitted designs in 1941 and finally selected a model submitted by Winchester, the M1 carbine. The 5-pound, 7-ounce M1 carbine fired a .30 caliber pistol round with an effective range of about 200 yards. A later model, the M1A1, added a folding metal wire stock, making it an excellent firearm for paratroopers.
The M1 carbine is an extremely portable, handy weapon, very lightweight, and it fires a .30 caliber pistol cartridge. It takes a great little box magazine here, holds 20 rounds. It operates on the short stroke piston developed by a North Carolinian named David Williams. It's an extremely effective weapon. It was developed in direct response to German blitzkrieg tactics.
Facing the U.S. soldiers and their semi-automatic M1 Garands in the Pacific Theater of Operations were Japanese soldiers carrying bolt-action Type 99 Arisaka rifles. After the war, thousands of Type 99s made their way to the U.S. as trophies of American soldiers. The other great Axis power, Germany, had also provided its soldiers with high-quality bolt-action rifles. The Carabiner 98K was the latest in a line of reliable rifles of the Mauser design, going back to the G98 of World War I. It was used by German soldiers on every front and throughout the war. The K98 was well regarded for its accuracy, at 500 meters without sights, or at 1,000 with a scope. But its rate of fire couldn't compare to the Garand. The Germans weren't the only ones who used the K98. The rifles were also popular among Germany's enemies. The Soviet forces, in particular, made great use of captured K98s in the early years of the war, when they lacked sufficient arms of their own. The standard rifle for the Soviet forces was the Mosin Nagant rifle model 1891-30. The Mosin Nagant rifles went back to the 1880s, when the Russian imperial government sought out a rifle design that could compete with the Mausers, the Lee Medfords, the Krag Jurgensens, and other repeating bolt-action rifles. Captain Sergei Ivanovich Mosin of the Russian Army designed the rifle that would bear his name during the 1880s, and in 1891, his gun was selected for the Russian Imperial Forces, incorporating elements of the magazine design by the Belgian Leon Nagant. Modifications were made to the Mosin Nagant rifle over the years, and during World War II, the most common variant was the design from 1930. The Model 9130 maintained the sturdy and efficient bolt action and magazine from previous models. The barrel length was reduced 2 inches, giving the rifle an overall length of about 48.5 inches. An upper hand guard was added, and the rear sights were recalibrated. A mounted scope turned one variant of the 9130 into the most widely manufactured sniper rifle in history. This was the sniper rifle used by Major Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the most successful female sniper in history. Pavlichenko, already an accomplished marksman, volunteered for service when Germany invaded Russia in 1941. She was one of 2,000 Russian female snipers in World War II, and one of the only 500 who survived. She was credited with 309 confirmed kills, which included 36 enemy snipers. But the Mosin Nagant 9130 remained a bolt-action rifle and suffered from the predictable slow rate of fire compared with the modern guns. After the German invasion, the Soviets began mass-producing a selective-fire, magazine-fed submachine gun, the PPSH-41. A simplified version of an earlier gun, the PPSH-41 was made almost entirely of stamped steel. This made it perfect for mass production, and by spring of 1942, factories in Moscow were stamping out 3,000 PPSH-41s a day. The U.S., with all of the industrial power it held, certainly saw the value in mass-produced weapons. In the early years of the war, the Thompson submachine gun was widely used. The U.S. paratroopers and Ranger battalions in Europe found it particularly effective in special operations. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, the Marines used the Thompson to a limited degree and generally preferred the BAR rifle's power. The U.S. military sought a replacement for the Thompson, something lighter and easier to manufacture. The .45 caliber M3 submachine gun satisfied those demands. Weighing just over 8 pounds, the gun could fire 450 rounds per minute with a higher degree of accuracy than the Thompson. It was stamped out in a shape similar to a mechanic's tool, which led to its nicknames, the grease gun or just the greaser. Production delays prevented the M3 from seeing much action during World War II. But it, and a later development, the M3A1, would be used a decade later in the Korean War. World War II had barely ended before the Cold War began. The Soviet Union and the United States faced each other as the world's only 2 superpowers, and their ideological differences made military conflict seem inevitable. But in those early years, though the tension was palpable, the extent of the Soviet threat was not yet clear. What was clear was the enormous cost of maintaining a large, well-equipped, well-trained army. In 1945, defense spending was almost 90% of the total spending by the federal government, up from 18% in 1940. Budget cuts reduced the forces further, and by June 1947, the Army consisted of fewer than 700,000 ground troops and 300,000 airmen. Though this was still sizable for a peacetime army, the loss of personnel meant fewer equipment and maintenance specialists, and equipment deteriorated rapidly. Meanwhile, the country of Korea was coming out from under 40 years of control by Imperial Japan and was being split apart between communist forces in the north and nationalist forces in the south. The nation was split in half at the 38th parallel. In the south, the U.S. maintained a small number of military advisors. The Soviets dominated the northern half, which was filled with communist Korean soldiers who had just helped Mao Zedong's forces take control of China. On June 25, 1950, North Korea, with Soviet and Chinese approval, invaded South Korea. The U.S. convinced the UN Security Council to establish a United Nations Command, or UNC, to defend South Korea, under the leadership of the U.S. and General Douglas MacArthur. The U.S. would bring to the Korean conflict many of the same weapons that served them well in World War II. The M1918A2 BAR rifle, the M1 Garand, and variants like the M1C sniper rifle, the M1 carbine, and the M2 with a 30 cartridge magazine, the Thompson M1A1 and the M3A1 grease gun, the Ma Deuce heavy machine gun. The Soviet guns of World War II were also present in Korea, only this time in the hands of America's enemies. The Communist Chinese People's Volunteer Army and the North Korean People's Army were armed with licensed copies of the PPSH-41 submachine gun called the Chinese 50. They also had plenty of the original, as the Soviets provided large numbers of PPSH-41s to communist guerrilla forces. Less accurate than the M1 Garand, the PPSH-41 proved to be a powerful weapon in the close-range jungle combat that often occurred. Although the battleground was in Korea, the war was in reality part of a larger struggle between the U.S. and the communist threat posed by the Soviet Union and China. And even after the major conflict in Korea had ended, the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union continued. In fact, at the time of the armistice that ended major fighting in the Korean War in July 1953, the U.S. had already been involved in another Southeast Asian country for 3 years. The small number of military advisors in Vietnam at that time would increase dramatically in the early 60s, as once again, the U.S. would fight a proxy war in Southeast Asia against forces supported by the Soviets and the People's Republic of China. And they would bring to that fight the latest and the greatest American gun, the M16.